Before Jim passed on, he was involved in this active planning. And so the topic that we're taking up today, and even the title, The Art of Storytelling, the delicate line between fiction and reality, this is a topic that Jim wanted to see on the program. So he's the one who came up with this topic. So we're honoring, you know, his desire. So we're carrying on this dialogue for him. So I then put together just an introductory context, and before I invite our panelists to talk about this topic, I just, in my, I guess, my professorial way, I kind of framed it with some definitions. And but it is not meant to be too heavy-handed, but just to open up some questions and to frame the discussion and to take us along in some orderly way. And so after I read the context, I will put the question to our panel, and they will answer the question, but first they will read a brief excerpt from their own writing, and then use that as a springboard into their answer to the question, okay? So here's my introduction to the topic. Fiction creates its own realities, and reality is made up of shared fictions. While realism has been associated often with the historical rise of the novel, so is the element or the elements of inventive fantasy and symbolic allegory. And while some writers might focus on documenting life as social realists, others will turn to even what we would call post-realism. Some people will say, well, you know, realism is over, or they are against realism, they're anti-realists, or they prefer to experiment with surrealism, or even what some have called, and this is a controversial term, magic realist modes of writing. Even seemingly realistic genres, like autobiography, are hybrid forms, they're mixed forms that can bend the truth to suit the facts of fiction, to echo both Michael Ondaatje and Fred Waugh. For example, at the end of Michael Ondaatje's memoir, and I think many of us have read this, Running in the Family, he writes that in Sri Lanka, quote, "a well-told lie is worth 1,000 facts," end quote. And in Fred Waugh's Diamond Grill, the poet qualifies this biotext with the statement, quote, "there are no true stories, but rather poses, these are not two stories," referring to his own work, "but rather poses or postures necessitated, as he hopes is clear in the text, by faking it," end quote, okay? So in Canadian literature, there is a well-established line of writing that the scholar Linda Hutcheon has termed historiographic metafiction. That's a mouthful, right? But it's historical writing that's very self-reflexive. And this type of writing blends invented characters and events with historical materials. It also reveals the process of fabricating this narrative in a very self-conscious manner. The long list of these works would take a long time to read, indeed, and this is not one of those graduate seminars on historiographic metafiction. Although I think I hear my students here thinking about those long lists that they've heard before from me, perhaps. The long list of these works would take a long time to read, but some examples of Asian North American historiographic metafiction could include Joy Kagawa's Obasan, which uses historical letters of Muriel Kitagawa, or Michael Ondaatje's The English Patient, which references the Royal Geographic Archives, actual history.
So I'm going to cheat a bit and read a family story, and it's a very small cheat, because this is an anecdote that found its way into Dragon Springs Road, the novel. So it is part of the novel, even though it ended up moving into that story in a different shape. There's a story told in our family about an unfortunate, many times great aunt. Her name has been forgotten, and we don't know when she lived, but her tale always makes women shudder with pity. She suffered from the curse of infertility. Impatient for heirs, her husband's family found him a concubine, this time a woman of lower class and stronger loins, unlike many times great aunt, who was somewhat nervous and of melancholy disposition. This plump and soft-spoken village girl began producing babies with predictable regularity. Then great aunt spoke with an old nun who said that she should make a special offering to the goddess of mercy, an altar cloth embroidered with the images of 100 baby boys, and then she would have a son. Great aunt fell to this task with a desperation that drove her needle flashing through heavy silk like fish leaping in a lake. An assembling of laughing toddlers emerged beneath her thin fingers, playing with a ball, spinning tops, chasing butterflies, the sons she longed for, painstakingly stitched in bright thread. The embroidery took more than a year and was the focus of her life. She presented the altar cloth to the temple and retreated home to await the promised miracle. But after a year, she fell into further despair and was pronounced mad, then moved into a quiet courtyard away from the main house. What finally became of her, we don't know, because our family doesn't talk about unfortunate events. When we tell the story, we even hasten to add that she was only very distantly related to us. In terms of telling, how do we incorporate stories, the truth, and fact, I think that I've been very fortunate in, inheriting a legacy of family stories. And some of them involve ancestors who saw dragons and who entered a doorway into the world of immortals and became an immortal. So yes, I have a 7 times great-grandfather who's an immortal, and ancestors who saw ghosts and so on. And the thing is, they are absolutely authentic stories in the sense that our family for generations and generations believed that they were real. And so I think that rather than call it magical realism, the supernatural elements in my stories, it's really more a matter of incorporating something that our family absolutely believed was fact.
Now I want to change what I'm going to read, but maybe I won't. I have a part of my book that also speaks to what Janie was just talking about, but I guess I'll just read what I first thought about reading. My book kind of looks like this inside. It's not quite poetry, but there are many narrative threads, which makes it hard to follow for me to just read a small snippet, but I'm going to try. What Mishima wanted: to revive the samurai spirit, to inspire and stimulate youth with a sense of order. Death in order. He didn't like that Japan's brutal side was reduced to peace and ikebana after World War II. He saw harikiri as positive, proud, opposite to the Western view of suicide, which was, in his opinion, defeat itself. In his opinion, harikiri makes you win. January 27th, 1700, a mysterious tsunami collides with 1,000 kilometers of Honshu, unaccompanied by Jishin. In Tofino, BC, a ghost forest. Skeletons, cedars stand in a tidal marsh. 300 years before, roots inundated by brackish waters. Sediments underlie. First Nations whisper a tale of devastation on a cold winter night. Cascadia undersea, land slides. Pachina Bay, no survivors. Below the marsh, dig a layer of tsunami sand. The number 11 is truly cursed. 9/11 was Chile 1973 before it was New York City. And earlier this year, March 11, 2011, certainly you must have felt it where you are, all those souls. Will Japan ever recover from the curse of 11? Will we? Is it the ill-omened combination of 11 and Japan? 1 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, a text from a friend. Massive earthquake in Japan. Move to higher ground. Tsunami coming. On the TV, no tsunami warning for Vancouver. Bare mention of an earthquake. Back to bed. 9 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, March 11th. Horror coupled with sadness. Japan thrown a new trajectory, painful and unwanted. My immediate reaction, fly to Japan. I'm going to stop there. And I'm going to speak to a few of the threads that are covered in those few pages. The first page, I write about Yukio Mishima, who is a Japanese author, and his opinions about honor and harikiri, and that's one of the threads that goes throughout the book. So I used him as a character. He did not give me permission, because he's dead, and guess how. So that's one use of public histories, like Glenn mentioned. And then another thread is talking about this earthquake that happened in 1700. It happened just off of Tofino, basically, and then a tsunami hit Japan. And I use that historical reference to contrast the fears of what would happen on the west coast of North America after the Japanese earthquake in 2011. And then I read one page that was true, for real true, of my own personal history about someone texting me saying there was a big earthquake in Japan, you should go somewhere higher because there's going to be a tsunami coming, which didn't happen. But I thought that was it really worked with this manuscript, so I put it in there. So this book really uses public histories and experiences and observations, as well as my own. And I guess when we're talking about fiction and we're talking about poetry, I think there's a tendency to think that poetry is always true, and that's not the case. People fictionalize poetry all the time, but I think when you use an I narrator, people just assume it's true. And so anyways, the reason why I say that is because this book is called Poetry in Canada. So I guess most people are like, just think this is about me. And then this book is called Fiction in America, and they still think it's about me. There you go.
My book is about you too. I'll tell you right now. Yeah, you knew it. I actually took a graduate seminar called Historiographic Metafiction. It wasn't yours, but I feel like I don't remember anything from that class. But anyway, I'm going to read you the very beginning from my last novel, The Conjoined. It didn't take much time at all, so little in fact that no one remembered the 2 days and 1 night the girls went missing during a windy weekend at the beginning of October. It was a blank spot, penultimate, and so near the end that the end swallowed it up. No one saw it for what it was then, in 1988, and no one saw it for what it was 28 years later. They were sisters. One was almost done with childhood, while the other was running full speed toward adulthood. They had grown up poor in Vancouver, near what the rest of us used to call Skid Row, where junkies and old ladies tottered down Powell, weighted with a thick, foggy high, or groceries in a rolling wire basket. Still, they had been happy little girls, the kind who dragged produce boxes out of the alleys in Chinatown to build forts in their yard at home, the kind who lay on their stomachs in the living room, waiting for the radio station to play just the right song. Some said they were beautiful, but it was hard to tell. Their real faces, the ones that might have emerged when they were 25 or 30, were still well hidden by fine, uncombed hair, acne, the traces of babyhood in their cheeks. We all recognize that kind of perfection, the bony knees, the lines in their palms that crossed skin that was otherwise unmarked and unwrinkled. It's the perfection that makes us hold our breath because we know it can never last. Ice cream melts, sunsets fade, and little girls can't stay happy forever. Storms and men and dark corners behind brick buildings will conspire to wreck them, and so it was. That weekend in October disappeared from memory in a matter of weeks, and the girls, so did they. So we're talking about incorporating like fiction and the sort of the falsities of fiction and nonfiction. You know, my 3 novels, The End of East, The Better Mother, and then Conjoined, I call them my Chinatown trilogy because they are set in and around Vancouver's Chinatown, which I always felt a great deal of responsibility to represent Chinatown and the Chinese Canadian community as best I could, especially with my first novel. As time went on, that responsibility kind of melted away because I realized that I was writing these stories that were my stories. Perhaps the settings were familiar to people, but this version of Chinatown that I was writing is still my version of Chinatown. And that way freed me up to be writing the stories that I needed to write. And I use real places and sometimes real events and manipulate them to get to something else, to get to a kind of emotional authenticity, as close as it can be, between my characters and my readers. A kind of like mutually beneficial relationship is how I like to see it. And for those of us who live in Vancouver, when I read passages like this, set in Chinatown, the streets of Chinatown, places that we all understand and are familiar with, I think that creates a really intense emotional bond between the reader and what's happening in my novels, which is how I use it. The other thing I wanted to say is that I've spent a lot of time lately, one of my books that I wrote, which is nonfiction, it's called Gentlemen of the Shade, and I read a lot about sort of the cultural output of the 1990s and how it changed people who are my age. I'm 41, and I think a lot about the cultural output of people who are my age, because the fact of the matter is that I'm not going to ever really be producing more than I am right now, because I'm, you know, in midlife. And I think that so much of what we create is marked by the idea of the mashup, the idea of taking what we might have called at one point high and low culture. Like I could be writing these literary novels with, you know, elements of poetry, talking with, you know, allusions to, you know, God knows what, Shakespeare, and talk about Kim Kardashian in the next breath. And I think that, you know, that's kind of relevant to the idea of a metafiction, in a sense. Sort of taking a little bit of everything, including reality and fiction, and mashing it all up together like the true sort of cultural magpies that I think people my age often are. That was a lecture for you.
It's almost Elizabethan.
Yeah, oh my God.
But I'm not going to try and say historiographic metafiction. Right. I actually said it, right? Thank you. So I'm going to read a passage from part 2 of my book, Stumbling Through Paradise. The person speaking is Sonia, the second child of Manuel del Mundo, who is the main character of the book. Sonia immigrated to Vancouver with her family when she was 13. Now, after 10 years, she is visiting her relatives in Pililla, that's a small town in central Philippines, where she used to spend summers with her grandparents, who in the Philippines are called Lolo and Lola. This is a scene with her Lola. Lola Iska hardly does anything now. The daughters-in-law do all the cooking and cleaning and looking after the children now, and she mostly sits in her chair on the veranda smoking her black cigarettes. She now wears very thick glasses, but soon, after her cataract operation, she will not need to wear those. She enjoyed the peaches I brought her, ate a piece and then gave the rest away. Don't you like it? I asked. Delicious. Must be very expensive, she says. No, not expensive at all. Eat more, I insist. Expensive here. Give to the kids, she smiles. Her grandchildren come to her and she puts them on her lap and brushes their hair. She hardly speaks now. I want to know what she's thinking. What does a 75-year-old woman who raised a huge family do after all that? I hardly know what to say to her, too. So much time has passed. Where to start? So I just sit beside her and hold her hand and put my head on her lap like the old days, and she brushes my hair as she smokes her black cigarette. It is the most soothing, comforting thing I know. How I know I am loved unconditionally. I wrap my arms around her bony waist, close my eyes to feel the warmth of her lap, smell the scent of her black cigarette, enjoy the tender, soft brushing of my hair by her hand, and remember it all vividly, packing it all in a bottle, the precious essence of love. You asked about how I've incorporated elements of history, research, evidence, real observation, and so on. I didn't realize I had incorporated so much because so much of my life is in here. But anyway, I unpacked all of this with your question, historical elements. Well, if you read my book, you'll see a lot of historical elements there. Film center collapse. There was the film center created by Imelda Marcos, and it collapsed, and there was a big accident, and there were people left in the mud, and they were so much in a hurry they had to build over that without being able to get all the bodies. I mean, there People Power Revolution of Cory Aquino, you probably know about that because it was big in the news. Canadian federal elections of 1995 to 2015, I followed all of that because one of our characters is running for office during this time. The swarming death of a Filipino youth at the hands of a South Asian gang in Vancouver, make reference to that. There is researched evidence. There's some things I didn't know. Drug use, impacts on users, the drug culture, and one of my characters is a drug user and pusher. Real observations, narratives of skilled immigrants, what happened to them, how it happened to them, caregivers that I'd met and heard about, reported about in my work in looking in Multicultural Helping House Society, the stakeholders of the Looking Ahead initiative, which are promoting the labor market integration of immigrants, and the community consultations around monster houses in the neighborhoods of Surrey and Richmond and in Vancouver, the consultation around racism in neighborhoods, English-only signs, in Richmond. Those were real observations that I put into the book. And of course, personal experiences, my own feelings of abandonment when my own mom and dad separated for 8 years. I put those feelings into the separation of Manuel and Josie in the beginning of the book. Pililia, my Lola and Lola remembering the feelings of unconditional love, the passage I read. Discovering deeply held feelings that resonated true for me was a real payoff in writing this book. Thank you for asking that question.
Thank you, Eleanor. So my second question actually takes us to a novelist, not just a critic like Hutchin, but the novelist Jane Smiley, who has also written, I think, a very insightful book about the novel titled 13 Ways of Looking at the Novel. And she writes this: everyone acknowledges that true stories can never be fully known. Too many details lack corroboration, too many witnesses disagree about what really happened. Every true story is unsatisfying insofar as it is required to be true. But since the novel is required to be complete, its dispensation from truthfulness, its acknowledged untruthfulness removes it from the world of consequences. The reader, suspending disbelief, expects a novel to take place in a designated game area inside a book under rules that apply only to the game. The end quote. So I'd like the panelists now to comment with just brief reference to their own writing on the idea that true stories can never be fully known. And what happens to the impulse to know in the process of writing for you? Okay, and again, we'll start with Janie and work our way down.
I was hoping you'd start at the other end.
You've had your time out. Back on the ice.
So that is a really interesting question. It is probably deeper than you realize, because when you, I think in real life, nobody expects to fully understand everything that's happening. You read a piece of news and you know you're never going to get the full story behind it. You know it's being filtered through the journalist's own sense of ethics, for example. When you read a piece of fiction, you want that feeling of completeness, you want that feeling of satisfaction, that you understand what the whole story is about. And quite often when you get to the end of a novel, you'll think, wait a minute, there's an ambiguous ending here. But, you know, I think it's also the reader has to bring so much to a story. And sometimes I just feel very reluctant to underestimate the intelligence of the people reading it, because if you make it too pat and say, and therefore the moral of the story is, I don't think it engages the reader as much, because you can, what is it, I think Salman Rushdie says something about, you know, that in the act of reading a book, another work is created, whereupon, you know, you have the written word that's the book, you have the story that the author has in mind, and then you have the story that is brought, you know, that the reader brings through their own personal experience. So I like that sense of ambiguity, incompleteness, because I think that's how you engage the reader, by allowing them the room to bring their own selves and history into the story.
Thank you, Janie. Leanne.
I think Janie should always go first because she's really good. That was really good. I think you really nailed the complexity of what this question is bringing up. What I'm thinking about is the difference between truth and honesty, and if there is a difference. In thinking about this question just now, when I wrote this book, I felt like I was being sincere, but I made a lot of shit up. So I don't know if that means I'm being dishonest, because I really feel like sincere. Like the main character of this book, I intentionally made ungendered, and they're of an unspecified race. But I know that, like, I was writing from this particular space I'm not going to mention, but I really wrote so honestly and sincerely from this place, but it wasn't me. Does that make sense? I don't know if that makes sense, but so I feel through doing it that way, I write very intuitively. I don't really think before I write. I just write and then kind of consider what I've done after. But I feel like a lot of truth came out of that process of writing from a sincere place, and then getting to a place of making a work that expresses many truths that I did not intend, but came out of the result of writing it from a sincere place. Does that make any sense?
Yes.
Okay.
Thanks, Leanne. Jen.
Okay, well, I often, so my first novel very much took the structure of sort of my family's story, immigration story. And I remember there's this funny thing that happens when you're writing something that's based on something that you know very intimately, and as soon as it's on a page and you have to contend with it, wrestle with it, revise it, do whatever you need to do with it, it ceases to become that story. And then you are only making choices for the narrative that exists on the page. For me, this does not happen to everybody. And so any elements of truth or trying to know the truth is almost completely irrelevant for me as a fiction writer. I also write nonfiction, and when I write nonfiction, it's a much different process, and it's a much harder process for me because I feel actually accountable to actual evidence, and like, you know, I have to cite stuff, like, you know, I had to write a bibliography for the first time in like 15 years, and I just about had a heart attack. And it's a very different kind of process, but even writing in the nonfiction, so much of that is just how I see the world or the topic that I'm writing about, as opposed to trying to get to the truth of anything. So, you know, when I was writing that last book, you know, Gentlemen of the Shade, and I'm writing about the 1990s existed in different spaces for different people everywhere. For me, it was about, you know, cultural mashups. It was about high and low culture. It was about Kurt Cobain, you know, and the Rwandan genocide. It was about all sorts of things. But it's different for everybody. So, you know, even as when I'm writing nonfiction, I look at it the way that I write my fiction. Truth matters very little to me, which is perhaps why I can never keep a relationship. But shh. Go ahead, Eleanor.
It's true. Or is it? Is it true? I don't know.
I also agree that true stories can never be fully known. Oh, okay. I agree with you that true stories can never be fully known. I thought a lot about this last night because it's a really chewy question. Very nice. Truth is so much dependent on who is telling the story. See the classic film by Rashomon, by Kurosawa, called Rashomon. So many different points of view, but they're all, which one is true? All of it is true, right? So, in writing Stumbling Through Paradise, I used fiction as a gateway to reality, not as a stand-in or a representation of reality. The reader, I thought, will have to find out for herself what reality is when she enters that gateway and process what she sees there with her own experience. I think a better word than truth or reality is probably understanding. In Stumbling Through Paradise, I was trying to give people not truth or reality, but a gateway to better understanding. In fiction, I think we don't just plot our story according to what we know the story should be. That's only the beginning. When the characters are fleshed out and begin interacting with each other, they have their own reality. As I developed the story, I found that the characters held me to their truth. I couldn't just manipulate them. An example is Manolita, the youngest child of Manuel del Mundo in this story. I didn't like her in the beginning. Too self-centered, until I got closer up to ask why she became this way, dug into her psychology, how her parents' situation influenced how she'd become. Then she became more real to me. And then as a writer, I became more compassionate to this character, and she developed more naturally, I think.
I love this term, gateway to understanding. And I think, Eleanor, as well, in your wisdom, you've already anticipated my last question, because you already had it, too. But, and I do want to open up the floor to questions from our audience, but I'll just briefly provide this question for the panelists. Again, just very brief responses, and then we'll open up to the floor. But my final question is, about how the writing of fiction has impacted your own life, your own realities, so to speak. And I'd ask you to briefly share some thoughts on how your work as an author has shaped your current reality in any way that you wish to hold forth on it, perhaps on the creating or uncreating of relationships. Or
How much time do we have?
About 1 minute each.
For each of her relationships, right?
Oh, no.
Speed dating.
Well, since I write historical fiction, obviously I've had to do some research. And as my father used to say, I'm really not as Chinese as I could be. I was a great disappointment to him. But here's what happened, is that in researching the turn of the 20th century China, all the stuff that went on the difficulties, the Japanese invasion, being a refugee in their own country. These were all things I did not want to hear from my parents when I was growing up, because I didn't want to empathize too much with them, because then I would lose all the arguments. But you know, I feel as though the biggest change that has come over me personally is I understand my parents better. It's a little late. My father has passed away and my mother has dementia, but I feel as though I understand why they thought the way they thought, why they wanted me to behave the way I behaved, why they value security and stability so much more than I did. And it wasn't really until I did all the research for my novels that I understood all this.
Thank you, Janie.
Okay, so my response is a little weird. Like, so much of what I made up came true.
It happens to me too.
Oh, gosh. It's so weird. So I wrote this book 2 years ago, and then I applied to Canada Council for a grant to do research for this book in Singapore, and I got the grant. And so this book takes place at in the Singapore Writers' Fest, which I had not been to when I wrote this. And then I got the grant, so I went to the Singapore Writers' Fest just to attend and research. And like the day I got there, I got this book accepted by Book Thug for publication. And so this narrator is an author who goes around like Asia and being in all these Writers' Fests and stuff, and I'm like, that's me now. And on top of that, like there's one page, and I say that like that this character is an academic, and I'm not an academic. I don't, as of right now, I have no credentials at all, but now I somehow got into an MFA program, and now I'm doing my MFA, and now I presented at my first academic conference this year, and I'm like, how did that happen? Because like I don't even have my bachelor's degree, and so now I'm an academic like this narrator, and I also, this narrator drinks, I still don't drink, but it might happen because, you know, there's reference to drugs and I don't really do drugs, but it might happen. I just keep realizing, like, oh my God, that came true and that came true, and now this is about earthquakes and I'm really scared. Okay, I'll leave it at that.
I have a theory about that, about writing things that then come true later. It's because we write the things into our fiction that we're afraid to actually ask for yet. So that's the story on that. Everything I've ever written has happened.
I'm not asking for earthquakes.
No, we don't want earthquakes. No. That falls outside the purview of any of this. I would say that the way that writing fiction has changed my life is that when you're writing like a novel specifically, I often think of novels as a writer trying to make sense of the mess of humanity. So we look at all these events that occur and we try to create a narrative that explains it all, that helps people to understand or apply meaning to things that could be seemingly disparate. And I think that as I go through my life and I get older, that tendency to want to create a narrative out of things that are like messy means that I go through my own life trying to apply meaning to things that are probably completely meaningless. And I think this can be very frustrating for people who are friends of mine, because I'll you know, I don't know, some dude doesn't text me back. I'm like, what does it mean? It means nothing. So it's so yeah, I think that you know, that is, I think, the biggest impact. And I'm not going to talk anymore about my relationships because that's just silly. Okay.
So how has this fiction changed my life? Well, people have asked me on the sly, hey, is this Josie you? She's the wife of Manuel. Is this you? I said, no, not at all. My characters are all composites. I make it a point that no one ever is the same as someone I may know or may have known or who has a similar story, because I just avoid anything like that. I change names, I change titles, I change character, whatever. So no, that's usually the first thing that they ask, is this you? And so that's no. Another impact on my life with fiction is that I find that I can actually live some of my fantasies through my characters. So for example, I just really love food, and I would love to have a restaurant or a catering business, but I know I'll never ever do it because it's just too tough, it's too hard. But in my character, Josie, she is a wonderful caterer, and she's successful, and I can describe all the food in whatever majesty I can, and it's okay. And so that's one of the advantages of writing fiction. Some people who really like the book ask me for a sequel. Hey, what happened to Bobby? Hey, more on Josie and Pililia, please. I mean, what happens to Manolita? We want more. Some people have suggested I turn it into a play or even a musical. I feel a little pressure actually to deliver to my readers, and their suggestions are on my list of possible future projects. Being alive to fiction, I see now everyday experiences as potentials for story. Example, meeting people on the beach in the Philippines while my husband and I, are, vacationing there. I talk to people as soon as they find out I'm from Canada. They want to tell me about how they want so much to go to Canada, and their stories, and I overhear conversations about with dramatic potential and all of that. And I find meeting people in the downtown east side, for example, where I sometimes volunteer, I say, oh my God, these stories. So I find myself jotting down ideas, just brief reminders, sort of like Chekhov's notebook. So how has fiction shaped my current reality? I've discovered I like fiction very much, and I like it better than journalism. In the past year, I've actually been involved in an online nationwide magazine for and about Canadian Filipinos, for which I write. Journalism is so different from fiction. While I have learned discipline from journalism, I also prefer the wildness and the freedom of fiction. The first draft, anyway. You can't get away from the left brain. You still have to do the editing. I fear the left brain may drown out my right brain altogether. So I am trying to finish my commitments to journalism so that I can be more free to pursue my fiction projects.
Thank you for these generous responses, all panelists. And now I'd just like to open up then the floor to questions from the audience. And you've had a chance then to hear our authors read from their work and comment on the major concepts that we're discussing. But if you have any questions that related to the theme, or any questions at all, I know that we have amongst us writers, avid readers, and just other interested groups. So, questions, please. Yes, thank you.
So, the whole term historical fiction is quite interesting because history is what really happened and fiction is made up. And I wonder if our authors could comment on the idea of, which we're hearing about a lot these days, about the alternative facts. And I'm talking about that because I read a book in which a historical fact was changed. And it's in a children's book. And I found it very disturbing. And it was changed to create an emotional context. And I was quite upset about that. So I don't think, anyway, if you wouldn't mind commenting on that, I'd appreciate it.
Was that fiction that you were reading that changed an event?
Yes.
Okay.
I mean, it was supposed to be historical fiction.
Sure.
So
Historic? Okay. Well, okay. So in my first novel, I referenced the Chinatown riot of 1907, and I moved it to I don't even know what year. I moved it later in time. because it didn't fit the narrative, the plot, the way that I had paced it. And I felt okay about that. I didn't care. And the thing about it is that the story that you're writing follows a trajectory, and you're making decisions based on what makes sense for your character's emotional, physical development, all their different kinds of development. So I have a lot of sympathy for fiction writers who change historical events. Historical fiction, as much as it's steeped in history and takes its inspiration from history, is still fiction. So I don't think that we go to historical fiction to actually learn facts. We go to historical fiction to learn sort of emotional truths, to get into the heads and the thoughts of the people who may have been there. So, you know, we may learn things about like the types of clothes people were wearing, or the types of light sources, or things about the setting, or even actual real events or real people sometimes. But the fact of the matter is that any historical fiction writer is going to manipulate any number of things. It could be an event, or it could be something as simple as, like the one example that I use all the time is that zippers on flies of jeans were not used until a certain date, but in something that I had written, I needed a zipper because a guy really had to go pee really quickly, and the buttons would have taken too long, so I used a zipper instead of buttons. Most people would never notice that. But these are the sorts of little things that we manipulate, and I think it's okay, because you need something to serve your story. And there is a reason that I write fiction set in a historical context as opposed to being a historian.
Sorry, I guess I wasn't entirely clear, because I sort of understand that sort of manipulation, but I'm talking about sort of like on the level of like Holocaust denial type of thing.
Well, I hope nobody does that. But you know what, I will say this though, that I think that when you are manipulating historical facts for your novel or your short story, it should be done in a way that's still believable to your reader, that doesn't kick your reader out of the story. So you do have some responsibility for like a suspension of believability. I don't know, anyone else?
I think that when you do something like that, and it's certainly something I do, is you put it in the back of the novel under the acknowledgments or the author's notes and say, this event actually happened a few years earlier, but for the sake of my story, you know, I put it in this particular timeline. And I agree with Jen in that the story is the main thing. And I do the best I can to make sure that historical facts line up with the events of the story. When I write a story, I keep a timeline on a spreadsheet. So
Yeah, no, it's
my
true.
first degree is in computer science. I'm sorry, I use a spreadsheet. And along one column, I've got the dates.
Yep.
I have a column for the actual historical events, and then beside it, I map it onto the events that happen in the story.
I do that too. It's just
Yeah.
not in a spreadsheet, because
Yeah.
I don't know about spreadsheets, but it's fine, yeah.
That sort of thing. Because if something major happens in history, it is simply not plausible that one of your characters would not respond to it,
Yeah.
would not know about it. And if they respond to it, how would they, depending on their educational level, where they are in their status in society, their hierarchy in family, that sort of thing. So I think it's okay as long as you acknowledge that you have made changes for the sake of your story.
Well, and I think the narrative has to support the change.
Yeah.
Your
Yeah.
story has to be able to support whatever thing that you're manipulating.
Me, on the other hand, I'm so very picky about being accurate with facts and with the events, historical events that I choose to put into the book.
You'll get over it.
Yeah, it's my first novel. So I feel free dancing around the events, with the characters, that play with the event, for example. But certainly not the event itself, not the historical people. I mean, the prime ministers that were elected during what term, and because I know people will research that easily, and if they find that it's not in the same year or what, it could throw the story in a bit of a credibility gap, and so I'm very careful. But like you said, maybe just for my first novel, who knows?
You care less and less, I tell you.
We have another question from Jane. Thanks.
I really like the phrase gateway to understanding, and I guess within these questions I think about like the sustainability of like the reason that I don't write novels, like I write more poetry, is because I've lost the ability that I've had when I was younger to sustain like a sort of like creating a really full world or a full truth. And I wonder like how you motivate yourself to write a novel as opposed to like a short story or like a whole manuscript rather than just like episodic things where you don't have to commit to one character. Maybe this goes back to the commitment relationship thing. Anyway, yeah, like I guess my question is like, how do you commit yourself to this world? How do you like stay in that world? How do you let yourself be attached to the world that you're creating?
Great question.
Shall I dig into this one? I didn't think that I would write a novel right away, but I knew I wanted to write the story of skilled immigrants. I saw what was happening in the community about them, and I wanted to describe it. I wanted to show the impacts on families. I wanted to show the other side. I wanted to show solutions. I just knew that was the story. And so it started with a family, and I created a structure. Okay, what should be the family, and how do they immigrate, and who should be in there, and so on. So from a germ of a family, and from deciding it's going to be intergenerational, then it just grew and grew and grew, and I knew it was going to be a novel. It was just a big story, so it was going to be a novel. So it just became a novel.
You know what? I write in multiple genres, right? So poetry, nonfiction, fiction. The only thing I don't write is menus. For me, it depends on your idea. It's less about the commitment and what the idea demands. So it's always, for me, dependent on that. And for the last few years, all of my ideas have ended up being really huge ones, and they've become novels. But I'm writing poetry now because that's the way those ideas are coming. That's the way that goes for me.
So I'm going to tell you, I think poetry and short stories are a lot harder than novels.
They can be.
Yeah, Leanne writes in those genres, and they are so tight, they're so encapsulated. There's so much subtext in a well-written short story and a well-written line of verse, so I have enormous respect for people who can do that, versus writing a novel where you're just kind of sprawling out through 100,000 words of being able to tell your story. And I don't know, it's just I need a lot more words to tell a story. And I think also it may be easier writing historical fiction, because once you've done all that research, you are so immersed in that world, you can't help but write the narrative and the descriptions and create characters that speak and respond in a certain way.
Do you want to speak to that, Leanne? Because you write such lovely
but I feel like
Leanne.
I can.
Go ahead, yes,
okay. I think what Jen and Janie were just talking about is like finding the appropriate vessel for the work. The other thing I would say is, when you're motivated about a certain idea, that will get you through. And sometimes you're motivated just enough to dabble with the idea and nothing comes of it, and that's fine because it's all part of the process. I mean, I wrote a novel when I was in the writer's studio with this lovely lady. I worked on it for many years. and I am not publishing that novel. But then, exactly, you need one of those, right? You need
I have
that.
2 of those. It's all right.
Oh, I'm sure I do too, but I'm still hanging on to some of them that they might not be one of those. But so I wrote that, and then I wrote like this bad poetry manuscript, and spent years on that, and then I wrote this in a month. But it was really just because I had been working on these other things for so many years, and I wasn't finding the right voice or framework for those motivations, and then when I did, it was easy because I did all the legwork. So it's just, when you're passionate or motivated, it'll just happen and it'll find its way.
I think we have time for one more question from the front.
Oh, yeah. Oh no, I wasn't. Sorry.
Actually, yeah. So in the context of historical fiction and in your research, how do you decide on the voices of your characters, like to make it believable? So, for example, like if you're working with the turn of the century, some of your characters might have a certain way, manner of speaking or dialect, which someone who's reading it right now, sometimes it may not be as easy to read if you were to try to make it really authentic, the voice. How do you make those kinds of decisions? There's a dialect.
Okay. You know what? There's always a negotiation between what you think is authentic and what you think a reader can access. So that's always a negotiation, no matter what, whether that's dialogue, a character's voice, or whatever. So when I start developing it, and this is going to sound wishy-washy, really strange and flaky, but some characters come to you and they just come and they're like that. They're like fully formed and they just came out of your head. Others, you have to work really hard. You have to write your character profiles. You have to write their backstory. You have to do all that stuff before their voice will come to you. And when we're negotiating between what's authentic and what's accessible, that really depends on the sort of book that you're writing, the type of writer that you are, and who you think your readers are going to be. For me, I usually say to people that the way that some people write historical fiction, where they have people speaking in very sort of complete sentences and grammatically correct ways of speaking, is probably not authentic anyway, because it's not like we have recordings of what those people sounded like. So write the way you feel that character needs to be speaking, and it'll fall into place.
I think that's a great place, actually, then, to wrap things up. And so please, let's thank Janie, Leanne, Jen, and Eleanor for their generous contributions to this conversation.
Thank you, Glenn.
Yeah, thank you, Glenn.
Thank you all, and I think that, of course, we'll point you in the direction of books on the table. We have